In this video, I'm here to debunk every rationale I can find for the Gulf War to make the case that the US military should never have been there in the first place, and that the maximum extent of involvement should have been the US aiding a coalition that wasn't led by any Western powers with nefarious geopolitical interests, despite the patent fact that Iraq's war with Iran left the country with $35 billion in loans, a lot of which they used to buy weapons from the US, and not only this, but $25 billion in infrastructure repair costs. On top of that, the paramount reason the US was in the war and led the coalition was because of the 1990 oil shock, because Bush, the first one, knew voters would flip their shit at increased gas prices, and the US dollar would tank since it's technically backed by oil. A war which was spurred on by the Ayatollah himself, along with the Khomeini government's calls for Iraqi Shias to overthrow the Ba'ath government. Reagan knew that letting two diametrically opposed hegemonies fight a war with each other with militaristic equilibrium wouldn't let one nation have so much geopolitical influence to the point where it would threaten US dominance. Since there wasn't a video I could find that took the affirmative stance on this topic besides one that was nearly an hour, which was just documentary footage cut in with rebuttals, which I might go over in the future, I decided to go over the most commonly used talking points in support of it and debunk them one by one. This point is right in the fact that he shouldn't have recklessly gone into Kuwait, killed civilians, and decimated so much of their infrastructure, but it fails to acknowledge the most pertinent fact, which is that the US aided and abetted his war with Iran, which wasn't declared without provocation. If you're the nation that gives an open fascist weapons to combat another open fascist, while all being open fascists yourselves, it almost seems like a calculated gambit when the vice president of the administration right before his swoops in and invades the country that owes you billions of dollars in war debt. Obviously, he doesn't want a superpower flattening his country, so he's gonna rely on us for weapons, and as a result of these dire economic circumstances, and being the Arab nationalist he was, he accused Kuwait of slant drilling in Iraq to justify invading them. Knowing that 20% of OPEC's oil supply was in Saddam's hands, that's when Bush and Major decided that interventionism was necessary because increased gas prices would have cost him a second term, which is ironic because it was the war that actually did. Anyway, they don't care about annexation of just anyone by a despot, but the annexation of a country that has oil, which is why they aligned themselves with Kuwait in the first place. I agree. However, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Kuwait was a British protectorate for decades, and in June of 1961, the empire recognized their independence by arbitrarily drawing the borders as straight lines through the desert, taking no consideration of cultural nuances and democratic decision-making, only serving the British and French empires. And we know how well the British and French splitting up land works for global stability. If a nation's borders are going to be redrawn, take into consideration the people actually living there to avoid any eternal conflict. Because Kuwait's ability to drill 20% of OPEC's oil supply was stalled during the annexation of Kuwait, he knew Saddam could jack oil prices around all he want, being an OPEC nation, which would have been adverse for the US, especially if Saddam did away with the petrodollar, which is what he did a decade later, and we all know what the consequences of that were. Yes, I agree. Not only does Kuwait lie on the delta of the Persian Gulf, whereas Iraq only has a coastal length of 60 kilometers, Kuwait controls the waterway to Iraq's only port, and the country's economic growth has been slowed due to a lack of trading opportunities. But this only elucidates the reasons for US involvement in Kuwait and the Middle East in general. Because of America's significant geopolitical leverage over Kuwait, and vice versa with oil, Bush and Cheney clearly wanted to reap the rewards of oil company shares. And you know exactly what they did once America got there? That's right, they burned the wells. They knew exactly what Bush was after. I said this exact same thing in my last video. There exist brutal dictators all across the world, so why aren't we constantly at war everywhere where there's some lunatic despot? As a matter of fact, we constantly install dictators that act as our puppets when we know a democratically elected leader won't capitulate to our geopolitical interests. And if you're not convinced by those previous arguments, just look inward. Who has continuously allowed human rights violations to occur in the countries that we invade, and who perpetuates atrocities here in the continental US? Who can facetiously just bomb the living shit out of any territory they come across, torture their nationals, most of whom are innocent, emancipate regions, only using them to fight what remains of the enemy, and do immensely more infrastructural damage than their enemies, and leave extremist regimes in their wake? Dictators? Come on. For Christ's sake, who passed the Patriot Act? Not only have I seen this one so many times before, but it's also the weakest point out of all of these. The reason any interventionist shouldn't bring up WMDs as a rationale for invading Iraq, either time we did, is that 1. Look who's fucking talking! We have the second biggest nuclear arsenal on Earth, and you're the ones pointing fingers at Iraq for using chemical weapons. We're the only country to ever use a nuclear weapon, ever! So using that logic, you see this country right here? Yeah, they have even more weapons of more mass destruction. You know what that means? Take them over! No, ignore the correlation between a spike in oil production costs and the decision to get involved in the coalition. Has nothing to do with that, and it's all about freedom and democracy. Anybody that honestly believes this is blind. What? What? Okay, so there's a litany of culturally distinct regions all over the world that don't even have themselves recognized as autonomous territories, but why do you all of a sudden want to intervene when there's oil involved? I know. Because in case you didn't get to the oil your first time around, you could use the Kurds as cannon fodder before any substantial number of your guys get involved. And not only that, but yet again, look inward. If you're the so-called nation of cultural liberation, why don't you give reparations to the victims of your cultural genocide? Why can't they divvy up nations the way they want to? You want to know why? Because you don't actually give a fuck about culture and are licking the boots of military contractors and war criminals! America has never had anybody else's geopolitical interests in mind but its own, and owes allegiance to nobody else but its shareholders. Because oil production costs had skyrocketed, and Bush didn't want one unaligned nation, well, unaligned after Reagan left office, having so much geopolitical power stacked against the US, that's when America decided to invade the country they gave weapons to. America has a long history of stabbing the countries it allies itself with in the back and twisting the knife whenever it's convenient for them. If America really was acting in goodwill, it wouldn't have decimated Iraq's infrastructure so much to the point where we sent them back to the pre-industrial age, on top of the damage it suffered in its war with Iran. The money-hungry, warmongering, genocidal lunatics that made the decisions only cared about rebuilding burnt bridges with the companies they were a part of, that wanted to win as many contracts as they could in both wars. Kurt Vonnegut once said, quote, "The last thing I ever wanted was to be alive when the three most powerful people on the whole planet would be named Bush, Dick, and Cullen," unquote. Which is true. In both of these wars, we all got fucked in the ass! And George Carlin once said, Dan Quayle is all of these things. Stupid, full of shit, and fucking nuts.
Dan Quayle is all three! All three! Stupid, full of shit, and fucking nuts!
I empathize with any culturally distinct group that fights for their voices to be heard on the geopolitical stage. As a matter of fact, I want to make a video on how China, the US, Russia, and various other superpowers oppress cultures because of their perceived autonomy, all while making irredentist claims. But what happened when Bush announced our support for the Kurdish and Shia rebels? That's exactly right. The Sunnis reacted big by becoming Islamo-fascists and trying to reinstate a new caliphate, encompassing the Sunni territory of Iraq and Syria, which is why so many US soldiers are there to this day. Exactly. I have annihilated every possible justification you could have for the US leading the coalition that went into Iraq during the Gulf War, because there's no morally correct position that can justify it, because Bush wanted to stay in office and keep on collecting six-figure campaign donations at a higher rate. When our country gets involved, come hell or high water, the people who are carving up nations all the way across the world from where they're doing it and facing no penalties whatsoever. I consider it detestable whenever these war criminals aren't publicly castigated every waking moment of their lives. And no, YouTube, I'm not inciting anything hyperbolic in a video game, no stochastic terrorism here, blah 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 metaphor. Ironic how the self-proclaimed land of the free is the most conducive to the creation of more and more totalitarian regimes that completely restrict the civil liberties of their people. Now that I've demonstrated that if Ba'athist Iraq was legitimately viewed as a threat to global stability, there's no reason that the US should have led, let alone directly been in the coalition that invaded Iraq, because America's handling of wars never ends well. Politicians and members of the presidential cabinet are compelled by contractors and idiot America, freedom, and democracy politics to the point where they'll bomb anybody in the world willy-nilly because it doesn't affect their bumpkin, hick, yokel constituency. What we should have done at the maximum is what we should do now, the Ukraine-Russia situation, and that's to aid the overseas efforts of our allies to defend against aggressor states while not getting our armies directly involved in combat. I think we should provide relief and humanitarian aid to the people who need it, and the absolute maximum of our presence should be supporting the effort against totalitarianism only by proxy. Imagine the American lives and money in the state budget that we spent on the Gulf War could go to. I mean, Republicans always campaign on inflation and the state budget, but when they pass bills upping the defense budget and lower taxes across the board, they turn a completely blind eye to social spending. It would keep protests at bay, stop totalitarians from having significant leverage over democracies, and keep Americans safe. That is the objectively better solution. That was what needed to be done. Thanks for watching.